talking back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan Hansen.
I'm Jake Friedman.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And today we're back on our old shit, talking about Kramer and Kiesling. This time with a deep dive review into their game, Torres.
Yeah, I think with this, it's official. It's the year of Kramer and Kiesling on Decision Space. We can't get enough, apparently. We are really intrigued, I think, by these two designers' games. When they design separately, for sure. But when they come together, there's just this really interesting mix of puzzliness, of direct conflict and interaction, of area control that rears. It's like I swear, Jake, the Wolfgang Kramer area control is like a Hydra, where every time you think you know what he's going to do in terms of bringing in a flare of area control for a game, another thing rears its head and you're like, oh, area control can feel like this and be totally different. And I find it charming and wonderful.
Well, before we get into our ratings and reviews, Brendan, I have really bad news for you. We have no more reviews to read in our reserve of reviews. So the train was awesome while it lasted. I mean, we read a review on like 5 episodes straight. That was incredible. Thank you all so much for leaving those reviews. If we get more reviews of our show, of course, we will read them out in the future. But because we can't do that, I think, Brendan, we have no choice but to shill our Patreon. So You can support us over there at decisionspacepodcast.com/Patreon or patreon.com/decisionspace. We're up to 36 patrons and we're earning $176 a month, which is like $45 a show that we're doing, which is like $5 like an hour divided, when we take that $40 and like divide it by 2, which isn't like a lot of money, but it really does mean a lot. It's helping us to justify continuing the show. We're climbing out of the red. And slowly but surely into the black. And once we do that, we'll be able to do more fun stuff. So if you have the capacity to, support our show financially at like $5 a month or something, the less than the price of a coffee, generally, that would be amazing. And it means a ton to us.
And it really does empower Jake and I not only to keep running the show in the way that we have and at the quality and level that we have to maintain things like hosting fees and software Jake needs to edit the show effectively. It also empowers us to just potentially get together and spend time together, which reinvigorates the energy that we have for the show and also gives us lots more content to explore. So thank you to all of you who do support the show. And if you enjoy Decision Space, if you want to write a review or support us financially, we appreciate all of it. And thank you so much for helping this project grow. We are so, so grateful. Jake,
excellent.
Let's cover Torres.
Ratings and reviews. I will go first.
Yes.
For me, Torres, I am going to give a 9 out of 10. I've really loved my plays of this game. I think it's my favorite of the Mask trilogy games. We'll touch on that briefly later. The only one of those I haven't played yet is Mexica. And it feels like a sweet spot for me between sort of an old school big turn design ethos and our more modern day preferences for kind of micro turns that keeps things whipping around the table. A lot to love about this game. The thing that holds it back a touch is I think sometimes this game can feel almost too much like chess, almost too, calculable.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? You know the word that I'm talking about. Where, it's a zero luck game. For the most part, there's a tiny, tiny element of luck that pops in. But, sometimes that's not a bridge that everybody wants to go over, where it's like, the dusty, like, this is a game for intellectuals and we are going to really, really put our thinking caps on and put that to the test. So that keeps it back from being like a 10 out of 10. But as far as games in that school of design go, this might be best in class.
And when you want to whip out your abacus and play some counting games, some calculating games, this is where you're going.
That's right.
Okay, great. So here's mine, Jake. Torres may be the most abstract game we've ever covered on the show. Despite its relatively straightforward systems, there's a lot of clever ideas neatly assembled into Torres that make it worthy of attention. The card system is especially unique and notable. And while Torres offers a consistently strong decision space with good game flow and decision pacing, it really seems to crest with moments of intense excitement. This is a solid, enjoyable, interesting game, though not a timeless or a must play game from two legendary designers who have given themselves a lot of games to compete with. So for me, I really like Torres, but it's like a solid 7.5 out of 10. Like, this is a good game. I really enjoy it. It's not my favorite mass game. And I also haven't
Awesome.
played Mexica, so we have this knowledge gap we're going to fill after we cover Torres.
Great. All right. Well, that's where we're coming to this conversation from. And without further ado, let's get into sort of the game background.
Okay, so Torres was published, as best I can tell, after Tikal at maybe the very end of 1999. It's really interesting. So the Mass Trilogy, the people largely place Torres in this trilogy of games that's actually a quadrilogy. Tikal, Java, and Mexica, Java also goes by Cuzco now, are three games that were originally published with masks on the cover. Torres shares a lot of the same ethos, a lot of the same design philosophy, like action points and verticality, a area control and interaction. We'll get into all the things they share, but it didn't have a mask on the cover. So people kind of largely called those other three games the Mass Trilogy, but over time, people said, hey, wait, Torres is actually a Mass Trilogy game too, and they sort of snuck it in there. This is themed more as knights and castles. It's really not themed as much of anything, except for buildings that go up and you want people high up on them. Which is kind of the theme.
Brendan, did you
Jake,
not read the rules, which it clearly explains the theme of this game, which is that like the big king is going to, leave the throne inheritance to one of his progeny that does like the biggest and best castling over 3 rounds of play.
wow, that's so forced. That's amazing. I did not read that. I feel it even feels like this is like dreamscape because it's played in an 8x8 grid. It's literally so abstract. But Tikal wins the Spiel des Jahres, the previous game, the original entry in the Master Trilogy, wins the Spiel des Jahres in 1999. Michael Kiesling and Wolfgang Kramer come back, immediately follow it up with Torres, a lighter, svelter edition, sort of taking a lot of the ideas, shaving some of the complexity off, and it wins the Spiel des Jahres 1 year later in the year 2000, which I think is really exciting and does sort of demonstrate that this game is different in weight and sort of scope than some of the other games in the Mass Trilogy, like Tikal, at least to the point that the Spiel des Jahres committee back in late 90s, first year of the 2000s, felt it warranted its own crowning with that trophy. So
Yeah,
Jake,
it's interesting. Like, it's definitely not a re-implementation of T-Call. There's too much different things going on here, but the shared DNA is so strong
yeah,
that it is pretty wild that they won the award back to back. Like, I can't imagine
yeah,
and maybe that's a virtue of just like fewer games being released
yeah.
here, but I can't imagine something like that happening again
Yeah.
this year.
Sometimes in comics you get like the like evil twin who shows up, where they're like completely the same but completely different. In some ways Torres is kind of like that. Like
Like, can
we've
you imagine
traded
like Challengers 2 winning the
winning.
Kenner
Yeah.
Spiel next year? Like, no, there's no chance. That
It's
would never happen.
it's pretty hard to imagine. Yeah. We usually, Jake, when a game wins the Spiel des Jahres, like to read an excerpt of the nominating committees or the award committees, sort of what they thought of the game. This one was really long, so I'm just going to read the final paragraph really quickly because I think it encapsulates the game and the decision space really well. So here we go. It's translated from German, so it might be quirky, but you quickly find out how the fight is going, and you're also in a constant dilemma. Should you forego the cheap climb in order to stand in someone else's way and thereby prevent them from climbing? Should you expand a small, largely worthless castle in order to block the urgently needed space for another player to expand another castle? Should you cheekily refuse to use up all the available turn points in the current game and instead buy a few action cards in stock? The rules of the game are a bit long. I don't agree, but you can understand them almost intuitively. For sophisticated Torres lovers, it also offers a more demanding type of game that pushes back chance somewhat and gives your own decisions even more weight. Um,
Which is
presentation is
wild to me. We could talk about what that variant is in a bit.
Okay, great. Presentation is first class. Everything in this excellent game is so simple, so clear, so smooth, and so obvious. At the same time, it is full of tricky constraints and cunning traps. This game is played often and over again with great pleasure. I think what they're saying is like it's really easy to replay it and it stays fresh, which
That
seems
yeah,
fair.
that's a weird one. I feel like often when you read these, like that is like the core essence of the game, and
Yeah.
this one it just seems a little bit more all over the place.
Yeah.
It's like yeah, there are trade offs here. Is that what
Do
they're? I
you
think that's what they're trying to say. But yeah, the I don't know. I don't. It doesn't capture it for me.
And I think for me, this sort of what they're going for in the first part of being like, you could do this, or you could do this, or you could do this, does kind of get at the core tension that I feel when playing Torres, which is basically, I wish I had 20 action points, but I, for the most part, always have 5. And I
Yeah.
never feel like I can do as much as I want to do. So if you like that game, the type of game where you feel like you're, just scouring for scraps, Torres might really appeal to you.
Well, let's jump into your previously recorded rules overview and meet back on the other side for our deep dive discussion.
Torres is an abstract action point driven game for 2 to 4 players. Played on a shared board that's a simple 8x8 grid, players are given 5 action points each turn and a menu of actions they can use to manipulate the board state. These actions include adding player specific knight pieces to the board, moving one's previously placed knight pieces around the board, adding tower blocks to the board, drawing powerful action cards, playing an action card drawn on a previous turn, and more. While knights belong to players, tower blocks are a communal asset. Scoring is conducted at 3 set points in the game, and players score points equal to the highest spot their knight has reached in a castle, multiplied by the total area of that castle in castle blocks. Tower blocks can be placed adjacent to previously placed tower blocks, so long as they don't connect 2 castles, or they can be placed on top of previously placed tower blocks that aren't occupied by a knight. So much of the back and forth of Torres is about trying to advance one's knights to higher and higher levels in the largest castles, while finding ways to block your opponents from doing the same thing. The action cards, of which there are 10, can be very powerful if played in the right situation. However, players are limited to playing at most 1 each turn. Additionally, with just 5 action points, Torres always leaves the player wishing they could do just a little bit more each turn. Finally, there's a neutral king piece that players receive bonus points during scoring rounds for being in the same castle as the king and on a level equal to the scoring round that it is, 1, 2, or 3. The king's bonus provides 5, 10, and 15 points each round respectively if achieved by a player, which represents a significant amount of points of those typically scored overall in a game. After the third and final scoring round, the player with the most points is crowned the victor.
Thank you, Brendan, for taking the time to record that rules overview. Hopefully, it gives folks listening a little bit of a better idea about how this game plays. And let's get right into it by characterizing the overall decision space.
Yeah, okay, so this is an 8x8 grid where the castles that start within the grid can never touch each other. There's on the board seated into it are 8 starting castles, Jake? How many starting castles are there? 6?
I think 8.
I think it is 8. Okay, there's a certain number of set starting castles that are never going to be able to merge with other castles.
Just like a single block for each castle.
Yeah, and we're going to be adding to those as the game goes on, spreading them out. So you start to have the available options for each castle to grow really wane. It shrinks over time. And also, each player has a set of 10 cards that they're going to chip away at, hopefully if they're playing well, throughout the course of the game, such that the options you have there are waning also. To me, Jake, this game really feels like a waning decision space game. It starts really, really open. There's so many different shapes and configurations the board could go into, but by the time things have ended, you have a really clear sense of maybe how you can maximize your points. And sometimes in a game of Torres, even by the final few turns of the game, it's really clear who's going to win.
I don't think I agree. I think for me it feels more static. Like the thing that defines my decision space more when I'm playing it is the 5 turns or the 5 actions that you get on each turn and kind of your availability of blocks you can add to the castle, which is usually 3 per turn. It depends a little bit by player count actually, but however many you get based on the player count. Those things feel much more like they are the limitations that's reigning in my decisions on the turn. It is true that you might be able to expand one castle less horizontally later in the game, but in exchange for that, you might be able to build a castle up vertically. So the way castle building in this game works is you can never have a castle that is like taller than its base.
Yeah.
So if it's a 2x2 square on the base, kind of horizontally is how I'm referring to that, then you could have a castle that goes up 4 blocks high as well. But I wouldn't be able to add the fifth one without first expanding the base of that castle. And so I find very rare in the game that I'm like limited where I don't have anywhere useful to me to be able to place blocks.
Mm-hmm. I feel like partially what you're getting at here is that by its very nature, Torres kind of feels like a game where each turn you're solving a discrete puzzle. And I think that's
Yes.
what's lending it that static feel to you, is each time you're sitting down and you're taking your big abstract brain and you're mashing it up against the board state and sort of saying, how can I maximize my points this turn? Not that you're not thinking about things like trying to block other people's options or something, but maybe more so than most games we've ever covered on the show, you can really sort of chunk out the turns and solve it as a puzzle.
I think that's exactly right. And when I'm playing the game, I don't feel like the decision space has like significantly expanded or shrank when I compare that puzzle I'm solving in the first turn to the puzzle I'm solving in the eighth turn.
Okay, so I think that I'm going to pose that it is still waning, but because it's so big, there's so many options, the amount that it wanes from beginning to end is so little that to you it feels relatively insignificant, even if the overall trend is that you are fairly committed to certain options just based on the opportunity cost. Like the last game we were playing, Jake, I had this knight like trapped over in this bottom right corner where I really didn't want him. And I had kind of like my flexibility in terms of what I could do with him was kind of like I didn't have any more available moves. Like the options had really waned there. I like moved him over so I could score a piddly 3 points and felt like I should really be doing something better. So I think for me, the waning comes from the permanence of some of your actions, given the high opportunity cost of doing almost anything in this game.
Okay. I can get behind that. And I mean, I think there is like a little bit of punctuated waning, the way the blocks work.
Sure.
You get sort of like a allotment of blocks. These are the blocks that you use to build up the castles, especially in the higher player count games. I think 3 and 4 player games, you get 2 blocks that you can use on each of your turns in the given round. But any that aren't spent can be spread out amongst your turns in the your remaining turns within that round. So if I don't spend 2 in the first round, I could put one of those blocks on my stack that is available to me in the second round or the second turn, and 1 block on the stack that's available to me in the third turn of that round. So it does feel like there is sort of like an opportunity waning there where it's like I have this long to spend all these blocks profitably, which is something I feel strategically is usually you should be doing. And then once I get to the end of the round, now I refill my supply of blocks to be parceled out over the next round of the game.
But I do think it's of note that you can never go above 3. So the most you're ever going to be playing on a given turn is 3. There's like this hard cap on that, even if you move them down the stacks, which I feel like that theme, Jake, of tower, like being able to push the tower blocks down and the way the card system works, which we'll get into, is really interesting. It's this like idea that you can like, it almost feels like the card system to me, like an action loan mechanism. You're like spending an action to get a card, but then you can play it in a future turn for free. And with the blocks, you have this like potential overall that you really want to accomplish, getting all the blocks onto the board because you're going to increase your own scoring potential with them, hopefully. But you can shuffle around when that's happening to hopefully get more information about the board state or more information about the cards you'll have access to, or more information about what other people are doing. And I think that's something that really stands out about Torres to me, is that sort of flexibility in terms of when you might do what you're doing and how it plays with costing of those actions.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting point. Some of the cards are so pivotal and allow you to break. A lot of the cards allow you to break a rule in the game when you play them, and it definitely feels like turns where you have a card available to use, you have a larger decision space than turns where you don't have a card available to use. Which in regards to that single mechanism, it's a little bit dynamic, I guess.
Yeah. And I did say, Jake, that I didn't feel like there were a lot of I felt like the excitement was always pretty good. The decisions are really consistent, but there weren't a lot of like cresting moments of like true excitement. But I think when those can happen, if there's the exception, it's when you use one of those cards to great effect and you have this really bombastic, tricky turn where you feel clever and it's sort of like someone across the table. Sometimes it feels like I've sat there and been like, wow, my jaw's down at what Jake just made happen using this card really cleverly to accomplish.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that there's not necessarily it's a weird one because it's not like for me all the turns feel exciting because you can get so much done and change
What?
the decisions like the
Yeah.
change the board state so much, right? That's kind of a trademark of these mask trilogy or
Yeah.
quadrilogy games. But if all the turns are like that, I could see how that again creates sort of level. It doesn't have like maybe the same dynamism of a game where it's like you do nothing, you do nothing, you do nothing, and then all of a sudden, boom, I've like created this huge combo that's paying off all at once.
Yeah. I guess we should talk about clarity real quickly, Jake. So this is a low randomness game. The only thing, if you're playing the sort of base version, that there's any variability with is the order in which you draw cards from the deck. But it's a deck of 10 cards, and whenever you draw cards, you get to draw 3, and then you can choose if you choose one to keep into your hand, and then you choose if you'd like to put the other 2 back on top of the deck or put them on the bottom. So it still gives you a lot of agency over accessing cards that you might need pretty early on, right? Over the course of the first 3 turns, if you draw cards, or depending on how you spend your action points on the first turn, you could find any card you need. Actually, you can get through the whole deck, which is pretty impressive. And then you referenced the variant where you just start with all 10 cards in your hand. If you do that, there's no randomness in the game.
Right. Yeah, I think it's funny the Spiel committee talks about like you can reduce the chance in this game because like the amount of randomness in the base game or the rules as written is so
Yeah,
extremely low that I'm not really interested in this
variant.
variant at all, just because I don't feel like I need to have even more skill infused into this like very very low luck game.
Yeah,
Some people in our Discord have mentioned that they only play it this way, so that's fine. If you want to play like a purely chess like abstract game, but I feel like for me the downside of this game, like the knock against this game, is how clear the decision space is. Right,
yeah,
you can pretty much calculate everything, and the only thing to stop you from doing that is that you don't necessarily know exactly what card your opponent has in
sure.
hand.
Yep.
So potentially if Brendan has the card in hand that allows him to move an unoccupied block on the board to somewhere else on the board, that could change my optimal decision versus if he doesn't have it. And I don't want to like necessarily think through the implication of all the cards, knowing that he can definitely do that if he chooses to.
Yeah. I think that also there's with any action point game, there's always the potential for AP just because you have to puzzle out your turn because you have all these combinations of things you can do. And if you add 10 cards as different options that you just have from the start, that's gonna explode the decision space in a way that I don't need this game to be. I like that it's a svelter, more approachable, quicker entry in the Mass Trilogy.
Agreed. Yeah.
Cool. Should we talk about the actions you can actually do just to fully ground it? I mentioned them briefly in the rules overview, but I think just talking about them here and maybe emphasizing their importance, it doesn't really work that way, but we can just speak to it slightly because there's some nuance and cost that I didn't get into.
Yeah. Sounds good. So we've been talking about the card play in this game. So first we'll talk about one interesting action you have on your turn is you can spend one of your 5 action points to draw 3 cards off the deck, pick one to put in your hand, and then the other 2 can be replaced on the top or bottom of the deck. And then, of course, you can play a card. So, playing a card, you get to activate it for free. So, that's what Brenda was talking about, where it feels like you're almost banking an action for later. And the reason that feels like that is that you can't ever spend an action card the same turn that you've taken it. So you have to at least wait one turn. You basically have to begin your turn with an action in hand in order to be able to use that action. And you can also only use a max of 1 action per turn. So the action cards I found that you have available to you at the start of your turn, I kind of orient my thinking and my decision space, like where I'm going in my brain, is sort of going around like maximizing that card because they can be really powerful. And also, that is an opportunity to potentially surprise your opponent and get into a position that they didn't realize or weren't expecting you to do so you can kind of get around their defenses in that way.
Yeah. And we'll come back to and talk about the cards even more in depth because I think they deserve a section all to their own. But I want to rattle off some of the other ones. So for one action point, you can place a tower block. So again, as Jake said, you can add that to any existing castle so long as it doesn't combine two castles, or you can place it on top of another castle block, tower block already in a castle, making that castle taller. So yeah, and at most you're going to do 3 of those per turn.
And some of the interesting decisions around placing a castle block is that if you can, if your opponent has gotten to a high elevation, right, on one of the castles, you might strategically position a block in a way that prevents them from further expanding the base, right, to increase their multiplier for scoring at the end of each round. And then you also want to use the blocks as stepping stones to move your knights further up castles to get into prime scoring position yourself. But you have to be really careful about using these because one thing I'm often thinking about is positioning my blocks in a way that will be challenging for your opponents to reap the benefit of. I think that's one way that you can really separate yourself from opponents and be more efficient in those actions is by using blocks your opponent has placed to your benefit by for scoring opportunities.
Yep. And when Jake says use them as a stepping stone, what he's getting at is that another action is you can spend 1 action point to move a knight already on the board, 1 space. And that can be 1 space in sort of in the coordinate direction. So like up, right, down, or left. Those weren't coordinate directions, but whatever, you get what I'm saying. And they can also move up to 1 space vertically while they make those moves. So you can go from just on the bottom of the board up to on top of a tower block, or if you're on a stack 1 tower block height level, you could go to 2, and then from 2 you could go to 3, but you couldn't go from 1 to 3. But there's some powerful action cards that let you do that. And then finally, you can add a new knight to the board adjacent to another one of your knights. But this costs 2 action points. And a huge part of that is because adding knights to the board is pretty powerful. One, you can use them to block other people's ability to move because knights can't move into other knights and tower block pieces can't be put on top of knights, so you can control space with them. But then they also represent your scoring potential because you need knights and castles to score. So I think that's why it's this sort of like more expensive action. And then already, Jake, just overall, you can also spend 1 action point to gain a point. This is not something you typically want to be doing. There's probably more efficient ways you could spend your actions. But at the end of the day, if you have no better moves, you can pick up a couple points as the game goes on.
In the game we just played, Brendan, I used this 4 times.
Okay.
Twice in the second to last turn of the game, and then twice in the last turn of the game, just because I had used all my blocks that were in my supply for that turn, and I had my knights in the best position they could be in. So since I already had cards ready in hand to be spent on the last turn, in the second to last turn, I just said, okay, then great. I'll just position myself well. I've played efficiently, so I get a couple extra points here.
Yep. And you beat me by like 250 to 239 or something. By like 16 points is what it ended up being. And I think I used it around 4 times too. So kind of a net wash. It's sort of, whenever I do it, I feel like I've burned myself a little bit for sure.
Yeah. I think that is right. It's always the last thing you would want to be doing.
Yeah.
Or you'd only take it if you have no other
options.
Good action.
And then I think the other big thing to note here is, or that I want to highlight, is just the relative simplicity of Torres' action point structure compared to other mass games. Tikal gives you 10 action points and has a whole menu of different options that all cost different things, which makes the math of kind of figuring out, okay, I'm going to do this, but that costs 3 action points, and then this, and it costs 2, and then I want to do these other ones, a little bit more complex in something like Tikal. And Torres has really tried to strip it back, so it's reduced it to 5. There's ways you can actually, through the special action cards, take more potentially on a turn. But overall, I think the math is simpler, the options are simpler, and the costing structure is a little bit simpler. And it offloads some of the complexity into these action cards, which is sort of fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think that is one of the things that also reduces AP potential in this game versus Tikal or Cusco.
Yeah.
It's just how straightforward your options are. Again, it's certainly possible or even probable that there will be moments of AP in your play of Torres, but there are kind of some guardrails against it here, at least in comparison to the other Mass Trilogy games that I've played.
Yeah, for sure. Well, should we talk about the spatial puzzle that's kind of at the heart of this whole game, Jake?
Yeah,
Like really it's like an area control spatial puzzle, right? You're trying to get into castles, you're trying to make castles bigger, you're trying to make them taller, but only if you're the person who's the highest up on the castle is the whole goal. And I think that one thing that really stands out to me about Torres is the importance of verticality, and it's something you also see in Tikal and in Cusco. In Cusco, it's similar to Torres, actually, where you're trying to physically move up a vertical space. In Torres, in Tikal, it's more about moving scoring options up. But it kind of was the germ of this idea that they then allow you to move your pieces directly onto in games like Torres and Cusco. And I think this is a really interesting addition that adds a lot of texture to the decisions. A lot of games don't play with verticality in terms of what's going on. And I think it's because in just a physical space, it adds complexity to what you're looking at and manipulating, but it makes for a really nuanced puzzle in trying to sort of look at this 8x8 grid and try to imagine how things might grow and could grow and to set yourself up to be able to benefit with them. I'll also say it's really fun, Jake, when you can cheat in a way and play an action point card that lets you like jump from maybe 3 to 5, and then no one else has a ladder to catch up with you unless they build one.
Yeah. It's one of the, okay. I'll say like one of the things that I think is like the hallmark, the design mechanism hallmark of the Mass Trilogy games is they're all area control games that give players the ability to organically grow the territories together. At the start of a game of Torres or Tikal or Cusco, you don't know what part of the board is going to be worth the most points at the end of the game. So in Torres, it's sort of the castles that organically grow the biggest because players together are adding to their verticality as well as the size of their base become more important over the course of the game. However, the thing that separates Torres again here is that it's much less all or nothing for scoring. Like in Tikal, to score points for a temple, you have to have the majority when you're doing scoring. And if you don't have the majority, you get nothing. And I think Cusco works the same way, if I recall correctly. Where in Torres, instead of working that way, all players have access to scoring each castle in the game, and they just score the multiplier. So however high they're at times the base. If I'm level 5 of a 5 wide castle, that's 25 points for me. If Brendan's level 2 on there, he's still getting 10.
Mm-hmm.
So that creates interesting situations where, you know, if you are at the top of the highest single point on a castle, right? Nobody's as high as you, then you always are incentivized to expand the base of that, but not perhaps as much as you might think, because if I'm at level 5 and Brendan's at level 4, then I'm just getting a single point more than him for each block that I'm adding to that, which is the equivalent of that throwaway action we were talking about of just gaining one victory point for one action. And if Brendan has the potential to easily get to the level I'm at, then perhaps it's even less efficient than that action.
And so maybe you want to work on trying to get higher on another castle where you can constrict your opponent's ability to get even higher there. I think the other thing for me, Jake, that's a little bit sets it apart from Cusco, which has that strong sense of verticality that we've played, is it's harder to block people here. It's still possible, but the opportunity cost of blocking is a little bit higher. So when you do it, you have to do it in a way that feels pretty clever, and otherwise you're just kind of making it more expensive. You're sort of blunting your opponent's ability to make a move effective in terms of gaining a lot of points, and you're just charging them more or less for doing that. So you're sort of trading your actions for their own, right? You're like spending actions to slow them down. Then they'll spend those actions, even though they'll have to spend more. And then you're kind of in the same board state. So you've like reduced the overall potential of how much they can do on their turn. But if you're ahead, that's okay, because you've slowed down their ability to pursue, right? It's this tension between, do I play defense or do I play offense?
Right.
It's just constant.
I think that the feeling of how easy or difficult it is to block somebody or become blocked changes also with player count. So in the 2-player game, it's really difficult to like fully block somebody out of a space because they're always going to have a turn immediately following you, and there's only so much you can do on a single turn.
Yep.
That if somebody wants to come along onto the castle that you're building, they'll probably be able to get someone over there. Of course, it might not be worth it to them, right? Because this game's all about efficiency. So you can definitely do blocking. And obviously, there's still a ton of player interaction there. But I found in the 4-player game, it's much more likely that it
Mm.
gets to your turn. And because maybe player A, started building up the walls a bit, and then player B was able to get on, but then that took up a spot on the castle. That by the time it gets back to your turn, it's just like, okay, well, that is completely now caged off to me in a way that doesn't happen as much in my experience in the 2-player game.
Another thing is in the 4-player game, there's just more pieces, more knights trying to get into any given castle to try to leech points out of it. So you're just physically, because the board doesn't shrink for 2 players, there's just less space. So it's easier to get cut off on a larger
Yeah.
player count game. Yeah.
And there can also be situations where it's like there's like a castle with a base of 4 and all of the blocks are like 3 or 4 high because 2 people have got onto it and then are just going up now.
Yep. Yeah. Right.
So that makes it really difficult to access it without a game breaking card.
I think for me, one other thing that's really interesting about the spatial puzzle, Jake, is because of the way. So movement is expensive in this game. It's an 8x8 grid. You can spend at most 5 points per game moving a knight costs 1 action point. So that's significant. It adds up. You'd probably rather be building out and increasing scoring potential rather than repositioning. But because new knights can be placed on the board adjacent to any other knight you've previously placed on the board, that means that as you sort of spread your knights out, you want to be thinking through how you can optimally move a knight to get into a really good scoring space that's also setting you up to add a new knight to the board that's either playing an important role blocking or itself will be able to get into a new space to score well, because the movement you do with the first knight, if you had added the knight to the board at the beginning of their pathing, you'd have to do that movement twice if you had added the knight originally, right? And you wanted to get the knight to the new place. But if you can move your first knight somewhere convenient, it's kind of like he brings the knight that he's going to in the future spit out onto the board along for the ride. So you get that movement like almost for free in a way. Do you get what I'm kind of trying to get at from the efficiency puzzle? Yeah.
Yeah, the where to place knights is definitely tricky. And also, like I find myself often in situations where it's like I need to move here, but then I want to place a knight and it's not optimal, like no matter which way I slice it. So sometimes figuring out those trade-offs is a place that the decision space feels a little bit cloudier to me than most.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing about the knights is that they block spaces on the board. You can't move through knights or jump over them or anything unless you have the card that lets you do that. Whereas blocks actually make it easier to travel around the board. I don't know if we mentioned this, but you are able, all the blocks have like little tiny doors on them on the actual like mold or whatever. And the way that works in play is you can always go out a door and come out a different door in that same castle structure for one movement.
Yeah.
So if there's a castle that's like a strip that's 5 in a row, you can almost teleport across the whole board by entering any of those doors. So that's just another kind of like interesting trade-off where sometimes placing a block first before you take your movement action can actually make you get a little bit more efficient movement. Whereas putting the knight down is actually cluttering it up.
Yep. Cusco has a similar mechanism. And I think for me, Jake, it's that mechanism in part that makes this like abstract space feel even more abstract, where I start to get this like, like Penrose Square type, like impossible space. Do you know what I'm getting at? Those like classic, like stairs leading into themselves, physical spaces that don't exist. Like that's where the space I imagine Torres playing out in every time I'm playing it. I think so much of the tension of this game and the interesting parts of the decision space for me come down to the sort of space between this spatial puzzle and the movement puzzle that we've really been discussing, and the cards, which is that in general, I want to be working on the castle puzzle, but I also want information about the cards I'll have access to. I also want to spend the cards at the right time. I also want knights on the board, but I don't want them all out too early because then I'm going to limit my efficiency. So it's really hard because they're sort of like, I want to do and invest in all of these things, but I can only do them all sort of in equal measure, slowly, ploddingly throughout the game, even though it feels like I should really push hard in one direction until it kind of becomes obvious. Do you get what I'm trying to get at a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think right, that's kind of the core here is the trade-offs present in all of these actions that you could be taking, and then the game is finding the most efficient way to
Piece
take
them
the
together.
actions you want, put your knights in optimal positions to score, and I mean that's really the game.
What's the highest you've ever seen a knight get, Jake? Have you seen it get higher than 6?
I think 6 might be
That's pretty
the
high.
highest, but you just got up there.
Yeah. In a 2-player game, so it's probably easier, and I linked together some action cards to make it happen. So I
think the reason you don't see it getting higher is because it just doesn't make sense a lot. Like
Yeah.
if you're already at 5 and maybe nobody else is at 4 yet, you'd rather be just like going horizontally, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
So typically the person that's highest up is also the one most incentivized to build out the base rather than the verticality of it.
Yeah, for sure. Should we talk about the cards and the card mechanism overall? I feel like if there's anything that takes Torres from being like just a overall solid game into one that's like has this spark, it is the card system, at least in my eyes.
I totally agree. I love the cards, and like I said, I feel like this is the thing that warps the decision space the most, because often you'll have access to like 1 or 2 of these cards on your turn if you're playing the rules as written, and they all allow you to break the rules in some significant way, and maximizing the value of those cards just feels so huge.
Yeah. So we've talked about how this works, that it's almost like this action loan mechanism because you're paying an action to draw the cards, but on subsequent turns, you're playing them for free, but you can play at most 1 a turn. And oftentimes I find that because these are so powerful, you want to be playing about 1 a turn. And you also benefit from having options, right? There's situationally, these cards become more powerful or less powerful. So that means that there's this tension in this game where you want to have options for these cards so you can play them at the right time. You can sequence them correctly. It's not quite that, but more or less. But then at the same time, if you spend a lot of your early turns just drawing cards and getting access to lots of juicy options for yourself, you're going to lose initiative on the board and you're not going to have your knights in the right place to necessarily take advantage of them. And that's a tension I love. It's sort of like, okay, I'm going to spend actions drawing cards. Do I have enough? Am I equipped with the tools I need for my next turn? What about my turn after that? And it's all about these value judgments of like, do I search for the right card here? Is this the right card? And I need to find the best way to just take advantage of it. And we'll go into what some of these cards specifically do, I think, because they're pretty interesting and there's only 10. But I think it's also just that system's really interesting. And then the fact that there's just 10 cards is really interesting because it's a card system that wants you to have feasible probabilities and really clear deck design. For the most part, what anyone could be doing. And like Jake said, there's just always that little question of like, does Jake have that card that's going to be amazing in this situation or not?
The cards are interesting too because they feel very like some of them are just always good and others are very situational, which I think works out nicely with the ability to kind of draw 3 and cycle through these 10 cards very quickly.
Yep.
You can even just juggle one by keeping it at the top if you know it's going to be useful, but not quite yet. And then the other thing that makes them fun, I find, is that because you do get 5 whole actions on your turn, even the really niche ones, because you are able to like do so much and play it at any point in the turn, like you're often able to find a setup to get value out of it.
Yep. So an example of a really niche one, and we'll see if Jake agrees, is this one that says, move one of your knights past one other knight by jumping over it. The knight must move in a straight line orthogonally. In moving, the knight may move up 1 level or down any number of levels. So you have to sort of have a knight in position to be jumping over another knight, but you could potentially it could be this really big payoff where you're jumping to a new space that could add a lot of value. But I find for me, that's one that's a lot harder to make strong use of.
No, I totally agree. I think that one is incredibly niche just because the situation where you would naturally just have a knight that needs to profitably jump over another knight is pretty small. I think it becomes more valuable in a higher player count game where there's more knights on the
Yeah,
board.
yep.
So yeah, that's one I'm often putting at the bottom of my deck and not using. But you could create a setup for yourself, like if you needed to, you could put your own knight in position to jump over yourself to like cross from one castle structure to another, right?
Yep.
And enter that castle from level 2 or higher if you had a knight on the other side of equal distance. So that could be a cool way to use it, but yeah, it's pretty niche for sure.
Then there's cards that just have potentially really huge comeback potential if you can set up the situation right. Like this one that says move one of your knights into an adjacent door and exit from any door in the castle to an empty space. So to translate that, if it's hard to kind of imagine. This basically says move up to the second highest open platform so long as it's adjacent to the highest platform
Yeah.
in a castle, which could mean, if Jake's all the way up at 5 or whatever, I might not be able to catch all the way up on my turn, but I can get all the way up to 4 if the board state is set up right. And that feels really powerful, where you've sort of scooped up all of Jake's maybe efficiency or actions in terms of building that tower up. And
So
you're
I
just
might have
like
spent
right there
like
behind.
5 actions and
Yep.
blocks doing all that. Now you're just in one fell swoop taking that efficiency for yourself. So that one is hugely swingy. And interesting thing about this one is that it's so much better late
Game.
game than early,
Yep.
which is kind of like another strategic element here of like you're kind of stacking your deck ideally in a way that you will be able to play and use that card effectively in the final few turns of the game.
Yep. Jake, the other one that stands out to me as being very powerful is the one that allows you to move an empty tower block on the board to any other space on the board.
So I love this action because it allows for you to take points away from somebody else's castle where they have verticality over you to add it to one of yours where you have verticality over them. In a multiplayer game too, this is a way that players can kind of like really team up to kind of take down the whoever's out in front points wise, which is clear since they're scoring at the end of each round. So I think this is one of the most impactful ones, and you really want to make sure you're using this tile and try and find an opportunity to get a lot of value out of it when you do.
And then interestingly, there's 2 action cards that are just dictate how many actions you get on the turn. So there's one that gives you 6. So this action card, because you spend an action to draw it, basically means that you just get the action back if you play this card, right? Because you on turn A, you have 5 action points, you spend 1, you draw this card, so now you have 4 more to spend. But on a subsequent turn B, you can play this card for free, going up to 6. So you've like taken a loan, more or less, and passed your action points to a future turn. And then there's one that gives you 7 action points. So that's kind of the same idea, except it gives you greater return in terms of the
Right.
quote unquote loan with our metaphor.
Yeah. So the 7 one is obviously quite strong.
Yeah,
The 6 one, I'm not really sure how I feel about it. I don't think it's worthless
it's weird.
because you can, potentially there'll be more valuable things to do later in the game, especially in the first couple of. So you essentially get in the first round you get 4 turns back and forth, and then 3 turns in the second and third rounds of the game. So using this to get 6 actions in the second or third turn feels like probably a pretty good trade-off because at that point you have more information about what castles are going to be the most profitable.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't find myself often picking this card because usually I'm seeing value, like clear value, with one of these other actions that just seem to be a little bit more like obvious. The one that allows you to just quickly jump to the top of a tower, the one that allows you
Awesome.
to switch 2 blocks. There's one that allows you to just add a block, giving you an extra block from the supply. That one seems transparently really strong. Perhaps the strongest of all is one that lets you to place a block from your personal supply directly underneath one of your knights to just elevate it one level. This is really huge because, often people will be trying to block you from being able to build up vertically, which usually requires you have access to at least one other block next to your person so that you can then elevate that one, step up on it, and then you start building the one you came from to step up again.
Yep.
So this allows you to kind of get out of a lot of jams you might otherwise find yourself in. So there's so many that are like transparently quite strong that I find myself taking those over the 6 action.1, but I can see how that'd be useful as well.
Yeah, but probably to me it seems like maybe it's not what I'm looking for typically.
Right.
So I feel like we kind of covered the cards, why they're interesting, why they're cool. There's also the mechanism of being able to see three and then put them on top or bottom, which again is this like giving you more agency. But one thing we haven't touched on, Jake, or two more things I think we should focus on to close out the show is one, the scoring just a little bit, and then two, maybe talk about what really sets Torres apart from other mass games. So we've talked about scoring, how you score every single castle, everyone who has a knight in it scores, and you score the height that you've reached. So if you're at a height of 4 tower blocks, you multiply that by your area, and you're only going to score your highest scoring knight in any given castle. So it's sort of easy peasy, that's clear. That happens 3 times throughout the game after everyone's had a set number of turns. Easy peasy, that's really clear. So that's the core scoring of the game. But then there's also this interesting wrinkle. There's the king's bonus. So there's a neutral piece on the board called the king that after each scoring round, the player who has the least points gets to choose anywhere on the board to place the king. So he becomes this really like powerful blocking tool for the player who's behind to potentially come back, and also offers a not inconsequential but not huge number of points. So the way this works is if you're in the king's castle in round 1 and on level 1, you'll score 5 points. If you're in the king's castle in scoring round 2 and on level 2, you'll score 10 points. And if you're in the king's castle on round 3 and on level 3, you'll score 15 points.
Yeah, I think this is like well balanced with the point like availability in each round of the game.
Yeah.
To where you want to be doing this.
You almost always need to do this goal.
Yeah. I think that is part of a winning recipe in Torres is achieving these bonuses on each round. Obviously our last game, I guess, came down to points to a greater margin than the first and second king bonus.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know, because in the first round, if I don't get it and you do, that's a net swing of 10 points right there, or 20 in the second, or 30 in the third. No, I guess not net. No, I'm messing that up. It's just you just get it. I don't lose them. I'm losing the opportunity to.
Yeah.
So never mind. Scratch that. But it does feel like enough points that you want to be doing this.
I think the other thing that this really accomplishes is it encourages conflict. It pushes people all into specific castles where the king exists and encourages things to get messy and everyone to get up in each other's grill. Because there's the potential where people kind of carve out their own space and they focus on their own things, and the king really forces you not to. And I love that this is doing double duty of encouraging conflict and also giving the player who's behind a powerful blocking tool to potentially come back. This is another area where I think you can have exciting moments. Where you can make a really clever move and kind of set up a situation that feels unfair to the player in the lead and really great for you if you're behind. So while I never like getting to place the king since it means I'm losing, the decision around where it goes is great because it's really open and you can do clever and interesting things with it. So I really like this mechanism. This is another way that Torres just adds a little wrinkle that's not too much. If you're teaching the game, it's not going to bog things down for another 5 minutes, but it's just enough to add this meaningful texture to the game.
Yeah, agreed. It also, because of you still score for being on that castle, so it's just a bonus that like the trade-off is not like great enough to not go for it, since you'll also be scoring for your knight on that castle. So it's just doing double duty for you. But yeah, I agree. A really nice mechanism for forcing interaction. I think people can get like a little tripped up over this rule, but once you understand that in the first round you have to be on level 1, second round level 2, third round level 3, it isn't too much to wrap your head around.
Yeah. It's also interesting because it means later on in the game, Jake, you like in round 3, you might have ways to get higher than level 3, but now you have to make the decision of if it makes sense to pursue that, because you would be foregoing the bonus potentially if you only had one knight. You have to literally be on level 3. It's not above level 3. It's on level 3 in round 3. So maybe, Jake, we can close with like, what do you find sets Torres apart, either from other mass games or just games in general? What draws you to it? We've talked about how it's sort of the most abstract of the mass games we've played in some ways. That these are all fairly abstract games, but I think this one really takes the cake. It's played on an 8x8 grid, and the options are relatively svelte. It's also quicker than the others, and I think it's the one that plays best at 2, but Jake kind of maybe disagrees.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't played any of the other ones at two, so it very well may be the one that plays best as two. I just prefer it at a higher player count, where it feels like the board state's just changing a little bit more
Mm,
and almost less
zero sum.
clear decision space, because I can't possibly predict what every single person is going to do, and the board state's going to change so much between turns. So that appeals to me a bit more. I think the reason this one sticks out for me is really twofold. I like all these games. First of all, I think T-Call is really great. That's my second favorite. I think the strength of T-Call is that there is more uncertainty baked in, since you
What
don't know
tiles?
what tiles are coming out. So I really like that. And then Cusco for me is kind of like the worst of both worlds, because it's like just as clear as this one. There's a little bit of uncertainty, kind of a different card scoring thing, but it feels like both like bigger and also almost like the same amount of no luck, which just hurts my brain. And I just like, it just puts me off a little bit. Like, this is just too much for me, where I feel like Torres is restrained enough that I can wrap my head around the game. I can wrap my head around the turns a bit easier. So I like that streamlined, and the fact that it's the quickest of any of these that I've played, that really appeals to me. And then lastly, I just love the card system. I think, the cards are so interesting, and coming up with like interesting tactical ways to take advantage of those cards, and manipulate my deck in a way that I'll have the right cards at the right point in the game, is something that I find really fun and just appeals to it tickles my brain and
Yeah.
what I like to do in games.
That's a great way of putting it. I want to go to bat for Cusco slightly because I think Cusco, for me, kind of has the most interesting area control of those three, just given the way the blocking works. You have a little bit more agency around the blocking, and because only the person who's the highest will score it in Cusco, you can have really tense cutthroat moments. But I think that the card system in Cusco, which is kind of this like auction mechanism in a way, means that it works better at higher player counts. I still like it at two quite a bit. To call far and away works better at higher player counts. You just need more cooks in the kitchen to make the dynamics of that game really pop. Whereas for me, Torres, like as a cutthroat two-player abstract, just really shines. It's not that I don't like it at more. It changes the tenor, and I feel like I'd rather play Cusco because for me, I think I rank it as Cusco to call Torres of the three, but I still like all three. And then obviously, who knows where Mexico will fall for either of us when we get those plays in. But yeah,
Awesome. Well, I think that pretty much wraps up my thought on Torres. For my closing thoughts, I just would highly recommend people check this game out. You can play it for free on yukata.de. I think there are cheap secondhand copies to be found online, in the range of like $20, then plus shipping or whatever. So I think the game is out there available, and I think it's a fun one. And I think of all these games, in some ways, this one might have the most appeal to modern board gamers.
yeah. And I guess for my closing thoughts, as much as I said Torres is sort of like solid and maybe forgettable and not a must play game, I think if you're interested in trying to wrap your head around really solid systems with nice wrinkles that elevate the game, so a svelte design that's made better by just adding the right degree of seasoning, Torres might actually be its own little masterclass in that, given how it adds this king system and the card play system that really take a solid game and make it excellent. So, like Jake, I think if this conversation has intrigued you, this is definitely one worth learning, and it won't take that long to learn. So it's worth giving it a play or three or four or five or six or seven.
Awesome.
So yeah, check us out. I want to plug your Instagram. You work so hard on it. So can I plug it? So Jake created a new Instagram for the show, which is a growing account that we have where we try to highlight games we've been playing, which a lot of the times means Jake sharing inside scoops on games he's playing with his Laughing Table Friends group. He also recently played a new Stonemaier game, Apiary, and posted a brief review of his impressions there. So that's really cool. You get these inside looks on games that are even still yet to come. So check out our Instagram. We'd love for you to follow us. Let us know your thoughts on this show or any of our other ones there. Just find us by searching Decision Space Podcast on Instagram, and it'll pop right up. Also, if you'd like to talk with us about this episode or others, and that's not your jam, check out the show notes for a link to our Discord, where you can, it's just like a chat room in your browser, and you can connect with us and other Decision Space listeners like you who love talking about games and unpacking what makes the decisions in them interesting.
Awesome. Well, as always, we should thank you for listening and thank Hembry for our intro and outro song, Reach Out. Thanks, y'all, and have a great rest of your week. Bye.
Closer now, 'cause I am